All right. Oh, I'm getting an echo over on the side there. Okay, hi everyone, online and in the room. The room filled up while we were staring at screens and Zoom. So, sorry, there's a very distracting echo in the room right now, but I will ignore it. Um, so it's actually gives me great pleasure. And for people online, we've had some technical difficulties on screen sharing, as you can see from the Windows camera and microphone and privacy screen that's up now, with the Zoom, so hence the delay. But without further delay, we will, you can just unplug the speakers probably. We will welcome Dr. Charlotte Moore, who I've actually known for a long time now. We were just commiserating about how we were young when we met. Um, and Charlotte's done a lot of interesting work in a lot of different areas, clinically, research, and I'd say especially high impact on policy. And she continues to do that. So it's actually really cool to be able to introduce her in this forum at this time after having worked with her for probably 20 something years on different things, and we then intersect and diverge and then intersect again like today. Charlotte is I'm going to read the bio as well, is a faculty pediatrician in the Division of Pediatric Medicine at Hospital for Sick Children, an associate professor of pediatrics at University of Toronto, and an adjunct professor at Institute of Health Policy Management Evaluation. So am I actually. At University of Toronto. Dedicated to a career combining clinical care with health system advocacy, she has held several leadership roles both in government, that's when we first met, and at national non-governmental organizations in both Canada and the United States. She now proudly serves as the inaugural medical lead for Child Health Policy Accelerator, the Child Health Policy Accelerator, which we'll hear a bit more about today, at Sick Kids. And it's the first hospital-based applied child and youth health and social policy initiative dedicated to closing the gap between what we know is effective in optimizing pediatric outcomes and what we do to attend to the needs of young people in the public policy space. I was trying to slow down at the end because we still have the echo, and I'll just go over there. Charlotte, do you think you can start, and we'll work on the echo? Um,
I think I'm gonna wing it. Should we wing it? Should we just be
Wing it.
informal?
we're gonna wing it. Perfect. All right. So then you're gonna stop. That means I have to reconnect from here, though. So Rachel, you know how to do that.
If you could stop sharing on that end.
All right, I'm
Let's
gonna
play the elevator music
Yeah.
for a minute. No.
Well,
Actually, you can
I'll
start.
wing it
Okay.
right from the beginning. So today's presentation is called A Bitter Pill, and it's a lecture that focuses on regulatory policy as it relates to the review and approval of pediatric medications. So if you are here not knowing what you signed up for, that being a lecture on Health Canada regulations buried under the Food and Drug Act as it relates to the review and approval of pediatric drugs, and you think that is a massive snore, don't go online shopping on your phone and don't pretend to get a page and sneak out the back of the room. I promise you, this is actually not only incredibly important, but actually really very interesting. And I like to tell stories, and the story I think is a really good one. So stick with me. Hashtag regulations are fun. I'm told you say hashtag before things. Again, I'm old. I will tell you that my first disclosure slide is that I sit on the board of a small publicly traded company that's a life science company, but all of their work is preclinical and totally unrelated to this presentation. My next, now I can see your beautiful screen.
Sorry, I don't know how to.
There we
Where's
go.
the slide deck? Goodness gracious.
Is it still in downloads?
It should be sharing here,
It's there.
but it's not sharing for
Is it?
you.
Is it in PowerPoint? Or no?
Let's try that.
Anyone will do.
You can advance from there.
I don't. No. Oh my goodness gracious.
All right. So the first slide is a picture of a big Canadian flag. And more important than my disclosure as it relates to this board that I sit on is the fact that I'm an exceptionally patriotic Canadian. The fact that I live in a country where, for the most part, my personal values align with my national values, I think is an incredible luxury and one that I don't take for granted. Oh my gosh, you did it. There you go. Boom, there's the disclosure. Boom, there's the Canadian flag. Amazing. Canada is imperfect, and we all know that. And today I'm actually going to be pretty hard on Canada, but I want you to know that it comes from a place of love and sincere patriotism. And that sincere patriotism, that sort of ferocious patriotism, was informed by the fact that whatever you did worked so well. This is where we wanted to be in the first place. Is the fact that I spent 15 years living, studying, and working south of the border. When I was in the United States, the fact that I wasn't American was probably my most distinctive quality down there. That being said, our neighbors, given their population size and their impact on public policy globally being so important, means that they have a lot of important lessons to share. I want to enter a brief caveat that my affection for the American regulatory system was established before it became the flaming dumpster fire that it is currently. The last piece of American legislation I will reference is from 2003, a long, long time ago. So we have a lot to learn from our neighbors to the south, circa about 15 years ago. And with that by way of introduction, I'll start with our objectives. And simply put, at a very high level, this is what I want to talk about today. What happens when the real world and our world, with our expertise and our experience, where we go to work and we roll up our sleeves and we get peed on by our patients, and the world of public policy, of funding decisions, of regulatory decisions diverge and diverge rapidly. And what is it that we can do about it? And to really understand this, we're going to explore one very specific, very relevant area of public policy that affects all of our daily lives as healthcare providers. What we're going to do is review the current state of the nation, so to speak, when it comes to ensuring access to safe, effective, and on-label pediatric medications here in Canada. We're then going to outline what current international best practice is in this space, what the international regulators are doing, and how Canada is lagging behind those international regulators. And then we're going to spend some time having some fun, talking about how it is we change. The reality we know when what it is we know is best for children and what is done for children are two very different things. And it's my hope that in this last little bit of the talk that I convince some of you that pediatricians have a really important role to play when it comes to legislative and regulatory advocacy. So let's start here.
It's not working online. We're stuck on slide 1.
Okay.
Interrupt you.
So right now there's a quote of one of my favorite quotes. It's an Otto von Bismarck quote, and the quote is, "Laws are like sausages. You don't want to ever see them be made." And I'm sure that there are lots of people in the room who, when thinking about especially regulatory policy, have that particular feeling. And then the next quote, which I'll share with people, even though they can't see it, is another one of my favorites, and that's from Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the rest." For those of you who have stepped a toe in the public policy space, perhaps, all right. So we'll do it without the speaker's notes. Apologies if I'm rusty.
But the theme is correct.
Okay, it's funny because I don't have speakers. Oh, that's okay. You keep going. Well, now you can just read along. Wait.
Reading the
Probably
online.
here.
Okay, just one sec. So for those of you that have engaged in public policy, it might have been incredibly discouraging. You might have thought to yourself, why is it that they just don't do what I tell them to do because I know more about them than they do? And in my clinical environment, people actually listen when I'm talking. And why is it when I go to them, everything takes considerably more time and considerably more money than it ever possibly should? Good grief, is there not a better way of doing this? And that's when I think about Winston Churchill. Sadly, we're learning this in real time.
Yep.
Round of applause.
Can I ask, are you a trainee?
Thank you.
So we are so old. All right.
Wait up.
Where I want to end after this hour is here. Because all of those are fair questions. Why does it take so long? Why do they not listen? Why is there such a difference? And I won't be able to answer all of those questions, but I hope to be able to counter some of those feelings of frustration and futility and overwhelm and confusion with this. Ideas are great arrows, but there has to be a bow, and politics is the bow of idealism. In this room of highly capable trainees and clinicians and research leaders, I think it's important to remember this. It will do our system, and I would argue our souls, a great deal of good if we roll up our sleeves and actually try to make a little bit of sausage. So let's jump in now, get specific, and as is custom, we will start with the case. So here's the case. Oh, sorry. I never thought about people maybe being vegetarian, but I'm sure there's vegetarian sausages. This is our clinical case. 14-year-old female. She has clinically active lupus nephritis with autoantibody positive, CSLE. She was diagnosed 2 years ago and is currently maintained on what's considered standard therapy. Unfortunately, she presents to you with an increasing number of disease flares and significant toxicities associated with her steroids. And there are concerns from her parents, and from her teachers that she's not managing her disease terribly well. So what would you do next? Well, I would hope that we would all turn to the evidence to find out what's new, and more importantly, what's most efficacious in terms of managing this particular disease condition. And lucky for me and for their highly fictitious patient, I would come across this randomized placebo-controlled trial, which is led by an international pediatric rheumatology group that included my friend and colleague here at Sick Kids, Dr. Deb Levy. And what this study would show is that the new-ish drug, belimumab, is well tolerated in children, and that the clinical effects of belimumab over placebo for patients on standard therapy, so exactly like our scenario, are favorable, measured by a series of both primary and secondary endpoints. And this data was in fact so compelling that in 2019, it was approved for use in children with a clinical profile described exactly in our case study by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. This was, interestingly, the first drug ever that was approved by an international regulator for the treatment of lupus in individuals under the age of 18. First one ever. So you can see on the top right corner the FDA label. I've blown it up here at the bottom where it says indications and ages, that belimumab is indicated for the treatment of CSLE in patients aged 5 years of age and over. Well, that sounds fantastic. Why don't we start this patient on belimumab? Uh-oh. The patient doesn't have private insurance, and you come to learn that there's no public coverage for her for this drug. And with an out-of-pocket cost that's on the order of $25,000 a year, the family's not in any position to self-fund. So we're stuck and we're a little bit stumped. This is a medicine that's supported by strong clinical trial evidence, that's robust enough to secure a pediatric indication for this exact clinical scenario by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration way back in 2019. So why doesn't my patient get access to this really important therapy? Well, whenever you want to stop and think about public drug coverage, you need to know about the Canadian Drug Agency, or the CDA. 5 minutes ago, it was called CADTH, or the Canadian Association of Drugs and Technology and Health. So I might slip back and forth between CADTH and CDA. They changed their name quite recently. The important thing to remember is that CADTH CDA is the agency that's responsible for performing health technology assessments of all new drugs and devices that enter into the Canadian market. And its role, per that first bullet listing its programs and services, is to make public drug reimbursement recommendations to provinces and territories other than Quebec. They have their own thing in Quebec. It's called INES. So in this case, if you're curious about public funding, go to the CDA and see if they've actually done a health technology assessment for belimumab. Oh, that's great. They have. That's fantastic. But then you read the fine print. And you notice down here that the reimbursement considered only adult patients over the age of 18. Belimumab is publicly funded if you have gone past your 18th birthday. There was no health technology assessment completed for our patient or any pediatric patient. I love that you look perplexed because this is actually very perplexing. So I'm going to pause for a moment and go very quickly about how drugs are reviewed and approved when it is they enter the Canadian market. There's a whole lot of acronyms there. You're going to feel like a neonatologist for a second because lots of abbreviation, very alphabet soupy. It's a very cumbersome, complex process, and we are only going to look at it at the very highest level. The important takeaways are few, one of them being there's a number of different independent agencies all deliberately designed to operate at arm's length from each other. Incredibly stupid. I didn't design it. So at the highest possible level, they're the one you can't see, which is great, but everything else works, so we're fine. Perfect, love it. A manufacturer comes to Canada and they submit a package saying, we would like to bring this drug to market in Canada. Reviewers at Health Canada then no, it's perfect. Let's not touch it. We're going to do a scientific review of this data. We're going to look at the data to see if the data you presented supports the claims that you are making. And if they are successful, the drug is approved and they're issued what's called an NOC, a Notice of Compliance, and they generate a monograph that aligns with the details in the NOC. Once that is done, once a drug is reviewed and approved for market and sale by Health Canada, it goes over to our health technology assessment body, the Canadian Drug Agency, or INES in Quebec, and they say you should or should not publicly reimburse this. It's value for money. Then it goes to PMPRB or PCPA, depending on whether or not it's a generic or a non-generic medication. They negotiate the price, and then it goes on to the Pan-Canadian Drug Alliance, and then it goes on to public formularies. Okay, so a whole bunch of steps: submit, review, approve based on indications, assess the technology, negotiate the price, publicly listed. But let's circle back here on what the CDA actually does. The CDA doesn't review the value of the drug across a spectrum. The CDA is charged with reviewing a drug based on the use and indications approved by Health Canada. They will not do a health technology assessment based on an indication that's not in the product monograph approved by Health Canada. Okay, file that away. Then we go back and we say, well, that shouldn't be a problem, right? Because the US FDA approved it for use in exactly our patient. We have this indication for this population. But then you look at the Health Canada monograph and you do a nice close dive on indications in Canada. No data were made available. So there is no pediatric indication for belimumab in Canada, where there is and has been one in the United States since 2019. I love that you all look perplexed. It means that you might actually be listening. So no data were made available, no indication. What happened? How does that make any sense? I've lived and worked on both sides of the border, and I can tell you this is not a physiology issue. Kids with CSLE below or above the 49th parallel, their bodies operate primarily the same. This is, in fact, a matter of our legislative and regulatory environments, how they differ and how well they attend to the needs of pediatric patients. So if earlier in this talk you're like, legislative, regulatory, not my lane, if it's not our lane, this is exactly what happens. This may leave some of you feeling a little bit mad or a little bit frustrated or a little bit perplexed or a little bit confused. How did we get here? Why was the data not submitted to Canada? I mean, the study that I showed you had a Canadian investigator, and that Canadian investigator enrolled Canadian pediatric patients, and it was that data that secured the indication south of the border. Why did it not translate into access for our children? You see, because if the data is never submitted to Health Canada can't review it, and the Notice of Compliance can't list on a product monograph a pediatric indication, and then the CDA can't do an HTA or health technology assessment against that pediatric indication, then the public formularies won't reimburse it. I mean, this can't possibly be the way it was meant to be. And it is. So if what is no good, how do we change that particular reality? Well, let's talk about that. Okay. Now, most people in this room are going to be aware, but I feel like it's necessary to say, children are not little adults. I'm not a clinical pharmacologist, but I admire many. And what I have learned from them is that drug absorption and distribution and metabolism and liberation vary very significantly, whether you are a teeny tiny premature baby or whether you are an almost adult teenager. Our patients range in size from less than 500 grams, or like less than a pound of butter, all the way up to a full-size rugby prop. My son is in that direction now. And not only is the body developing and changing quite dramatically during this time, we've got a developing brain at play as well. Now, again, for those of you that are clinical generalists and not clinical pharmacologists, I highly recommend this relatively recently reviewed article from the New England Journal of Medicine. It very accessibly and eloquently details the number of different ways that our drug absorption and liberation and distribution and elimination vary, whether it be gastric pH varying by age or volume of distribution varying by age or GFR by age, so on and so forth. And there's actually new data coming out that looks at not only fundamental physiology, but also pharmacogenomics, adding an additional layer of developmental complexity. So how it is we use and dose medications for 1-year-olds is likely not the way for 101-year-olds. So with that by way of biological background, it should be absolutely clear to all of us and regulators that children and youth require drug use and dosing information that is specific and unique to them. And as drug regulators for entire populations, they have a duty to ensure that safe and effective information is available to all, regardless of age. The trouble is, and why I'm here today, is that that's actually not the case. A huge percentage of the drug use and dosing information we rely on daily in pediatrics is actually just based on extrapolation from adult studies. Those very same adults that we all just agreed on are not just gigantic kids. So with that as our evidence base, or lack thereof, a great many of the drugs we use routinely in pediatrics actually have never had use and dosing information submitted and reviewed by and approved by regulatory authorities. And when I say regulatory authorities, I mean the agencies of government that are responsible for ensuring that products on the market are safe and effective for the patients that receive them. In fact, in Canada, depending on the condition and the clinical setting, up to 80% of drug use is off-label. And the populations that are most vulnerable are those most likely to experience it. So neonatal and infant populations, patients in ICU settings, and patients with mental illness. It's very important to stop here and note that off-label does not always mean off-evidence. There's often robust bodies of literature that are developed around drug and drug use once a product has been labeled. But our rates of off-label drug use do speak to the regulatory protections that are in place for those populations. There is a reason why regulators approve dose and indication. And if 80% of our drug use does not fall under those confines, government has their eye off the ball when it comes to protecting our particular patients. So, how did it come to be this way? I told you I like stories. This is a really, really good one. We're going to go way back to the 1930s. We were not quite born yet, but close. This was at a time when life-saving antibiotics were launching the first therapeutic revolution in modern medicine, and at a time when governments had basically no role in or authority over the market or sale of food and drugs. Let's just pause on that for a moment. Less than 100 years ago, governments did not have any role in approving the sale of health products. Anyone could make a health claim, put a product on a shelf, and sell it. That was less than 100 years ago. Because our specific story, oh gosh. No, read ahead, there. Our specific story starts back in 1937 with the elixir of sulfonamide tragedy. this is considered one of the most consequential accidental mass poisonings of the 20th century. So when sulfa was first introduced, everyone was really excited. We now can kill bacteria. That's a universally positive thing, paradigm shifting thing. But the drug was only manufactured in pills that were sort of a size suitable for a horse and in a dose suitable for a large adult male. So kids were going to be left out of this therapeutic revolution. Along comes the Massengill Corporation. The Massengill Corporation, yeah, you can see that at the bottom there. An American pharmaceutical company that said, hey, there's a market here. Why don't we take these adult tablets? Why don't we dissolve them in diethylene glycol? Because it's very effective at diluting and suspending things. We'll add some raspberry syrup. Ba-boom. We can treat kids for bacterial infections. So on the shelves it went, the elixir of sulfonamide. And turns out diethylene glycol is a very effective excipient. It's also an incredibly powerful nephrotoxin. Over 100 children died of renal failure within weeks of this product entering the market. Again, it's shocking to think that it was less than 100 years ago where there was absolutely no legislation in place or regulations in force that required a company to prove its product safe prior to selling that product to the public. But it was in reaction to this particular pediatric calamity that the US Congress stood up an act. And in 1938, they passed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, and it was signed into law by President Franklin Roosevelt. This landmark piece of legislation set the stage for the establishment of the Food and Drug Administration, and similar regulatory authorities were then copied by regulators around the world. And they said, universe, you cannot bring a health product to market unless you can first prove that it is safe. Now, I think we'd all argue that this is not going to kill you is a pretty low bar when it comes to clinical care, but it wasn't for another 30 years before our regulatory infrastructure caught up. Once again, it was two high-profile pediatric therapeutic tragedies that led to legislative amendments to address that particular shortcoming. And the first was this one. This was the gray baby epidemic associated with the use of chloramphenicol in very young children. So like sulfa, when chloramphenicol was introduced, everyone was super excited. Chloramphenicol is really very, very good at killing a bunch of very, very nasty bugs. Unfortunately, however, it's also good at killing bone marrow if the concentration of chloramphenicol in your body is too high. So soon after chloramphenicol was introduced to market, you could see that there were case clusters of fatal aplastic anemia, primarily in newborn units, and eventually it was linked back to the use of the drug. And you can see in this New England Journal of Medicine article from 1962 that the mean blood levels of a drug decline at substantially different rates depending on the age of the patients, with newborns having a particularly slow decline. So it was from this study and other studies that were initiated only after the case reports of fatal aplastic anemia that it was determined that there was this changing drug metabolizing enzyme, which is called UGT, it's got a longer name, which I can't pronounce, caused this variation. And what this tragedy taught the world was age matters. This happened right at around the same time that this happened. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, there were German physicians, and then there was Australian and Scottish and English physicians who discerned this relationship between thalidomide use in pregnancy and significant congenital malformations. I love this letter to the editor, written by someone named Dr. McBride, who sort of like casually writes in, has anyone seen similar abnormalities in these babies? Just curious. I mean, it's literally about 12 lines. Thalidomide, as we all know now, was responsible for, quote, the first recorded epidemic of iatrogenic disease affecting the human fetus. And children were not spared this in Canada. There was a special article published in the CMAJ at around that same time that detailed the impact to 115 Canadian children born between 1961 and 62. So these two tragedies together re-stimulated global interest in this idea of regulatory safety when it came to medicines. And once again, the US led. They established new standards in terms of the types of evidence and the quality of evidence that was required to secure drug approval. Specifically, these two tragedies led to something called the Kiefer-Harris Amendments, named after the two lawmakers who pushed these legislative amendments forward. And they expanded the authorities of the FDA to say, you know what, you need animal studies, you need preclinical studies, and you need population-specific efficacy studies. We need to know which drug in which patient is suitable for what use and how. And again, these specific authorities were rapidly adopted by regulators all over the world, including Canada. So how is it then, when it was 3 pediatric therapeutic tragedies that stimulated the passage of this foundational legislation that governs drug approval for everybody, that children seem somehow systematically excluded from these regulatory protections? With off-label drug use rates reaching 80%, it's impossible to argue that our regulators don't have their eye off the ball when it comes to our particular patients. Well, it was because the pain of those 3 particular therapeutic tragedies was so acute, so painful, that children were built up to be a protected class. At the time, the logic became children are so vulnerable, clearly based on what we've seen. We must protect them from the risks and perils of drug research. And that well-meaning, albeit highly flawed, prevailing, now very outdated logic accounts for a lot of the pragmatic and logistical and financial barriers that exist to the conduct of pediatric clinical trials remaining to this very day. Now, obviously, there's ethical and epidemiologic complexity associated with the study of pediatric disease, but those things we can't change, and the pragmatic, logistical, financial, and regulatory barriers are things that are not immutable, things within our power to control and change. Now, thankfully, once again, south of the border, a group of passionate pediatricians in the 1990s stood up and said, hold on. This system that you've created in response to tragedies affecting our patients is no longer serving them. And those passionate pediatricians worked with Congress and the Food and Drug Administration to craft over time a series of legislative and regulatory changes to right-size the role of drug regulators to specifically attend to pediatric needs. And I list a lot of those there. It took them a while. They had to experiment a bit. They were the first out of the gate. False start in 94, false start in 97, false start in 98. It really wasn't until they passed the BCPA and PREA, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act and the Pediatric Research Equity Act, that we really got traction, oh my gosh, in terms of serving the needs of kids from a regulatory perspective. And I will highlight that in lockstep with the FDA, the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, that's the FDA equivalent for the entire European Union, was working in lockstep. So how did these 2 regulatory modernization initiatives actually achieve this? It was a combination of both carrots and sticks. First, and importantly, they put money on the table. Dedicated money and big money to study drugs in kids, both old drugs and new drugs. But in parallel, they also created a mandate. They said, hey, you pharma, if drug use is expected in children, if you're creating an antibiotic, if you're creating an asthma drug, if you're creating a mental health medication, if you're creating a biologic where drug use in children could be expected or anticipated, you've got to study that population. You can ignore it no more. It must be part of the package you submit to us, or at least a plan to study it must be in the package you submit, or we will not review and approve your drug for our gigantic big market. And this facilitated this incredibly important mind shift that children don't need to be protected from research. Children are best protected through research. And we do have to give the United States credit for that. And did it work? Well, as of July this year, over 1,300 pediatric labeling changes in the United States, both old medications and new medications, were attributed to the powers of PREA and the BCPA. And they have been able to decrease their off-label prescribing rate, which used to be parallel to ours, down to less than 50%. It's not zero, they got a ways to go, but they've made a huge dent. This is another way of looking at the data. This is data that's released by the FDA, and it tracks PREA and BCPA associated legislative changes over time. And that Success stimulated parallel reforms, not just in the US and the EU, but Switzerland instituted a similar rule. You must submit pediatric data. And the MHRA, the Drug Regulatory Authority in the UK, when they separated from the EU, brought that with them. They said, no, you got to submit pediatric data. Australia, halfway around the world, South Korea, Japan, on and on. So what's been Canada doing? The whole world is saying you must submit pediatric data when pediatric use can be expected or anticipated, right? Absolute crickets from Health Canada. Canada is the only leading regulator in the world that does not mandate the submission of pediatric data when pediatric use can be expected or anticipated. This systematically I know, my face is like that too. What this means is not only are they afforded the safety protection, sure, we can look at the adult label, but we do know that any off-label drug use is associated with increased medical error. And more importantly, we know that off-label drug use in Canada, because of how all of our public infrastructure is established, creates systematic structural access barriers, driving us to need to address the root of the problem. We are now 3 decades out of step with not just international best practice, but international norms when it comes to regulatory practice. And just how big is this problem? This study, especially for trainees in the room, sometimes the simplest studies can be the most elegant and the most powerful. This was a study published in 2020 by a group out of McMaster, although there was national participation, looking at pediatric drug data in Canadian drug monographs. So they said, how well is Canada doing at attending to the needs of pediatric patients? You can see that even adolescents, 12 to 17, were only represented in 25% of the new product monographs coming forward. 75% of the new drugs approved in Canada in a 10-year period didn't even contemplate use in adolescents. And that significantly drops off as you get younger and younger. Only 4% contemplated infants really ever getting sick at all. Why would a baby ever need a drug? This is shocking regulatory neglect. It's hard to imagine it or position it any other way. And I've told you the belimumab story, but I can tell you for both pediatric medications and formulations, this is every subspecialty, every discipline, medications in every place in pediatric practice. So what are we going to do about this? So now that we really understand the problem, I would argue we have an obligation. We have an obligation to understand how legislative and regulatory reform happens in Canada and to make this change a reality where it is we live. Got 2 more American quotes coming at you again from a long, long time ago. I love this Kennedy quote. He says, unless there is the most intimate association between those who look to the far horizons, and for that he was referring to government, looking at a big landscape, thinking about the whole population, and those who deal with our daily problems, and that is all of us, we shall not pass through these stormy times with success. Our democracy requires us to share what it is we know with those people who are elected to represent us and those bureaucrats who are afforded extraordinary authority in terms of creating the legislative and regulatory infrastructure that we survive in. So I'm going to tell you 2 little secrets now. Don't tell anyone that I told you, but we're going to talk a bit about the change journey. And if you're going to join me on these change journeys, it's important that you know these 2 things. First off, elected officials love to lead, but in Canada, they love to lead so long as someone else has actually already gone before them, completely and totally de-risked the experiment and proven that it was both safe and well-liked. Good news for us, that's already happened. And 2, regardless of what you say to a civil servant, the status quo is always the safest. There is significant risk in change, which is why no is always the safest answer. So you need to convince the bureaucracy that no is actually associated with demonstrable risk over and above the change you are presenting. And once again, lucky for us, we've got that data too. So 30 years I said 30 years, we are out of step. And it is not because Canadian pediatricians, health scientists, economists, and policy researchers have not been trying to make headway in this particular space. And I point to these two particular reports. There was a CCA report in the early 2010s, as well as a Senate committee report on the significant use of off-label drugs that highlights the off-label drug problem in Canada. Both of those reports are 15 plus years old. They're both incredibly well done. But reports get you barely to the starting line of a particular marathon. Don't ever imagine that a report is going to get you to the finish line. 15 plus years later, after these reports were written by the greatest minds in Canada as it relates to pediatric pharmacology, still no change. I'm not a great mind. I like to think of myself as a fish or a sausage maker. There's lots of metaphors you can potentially use. But I'm happy to stand on the shoulders of those giants and set, make, know, be, and get in terms of ensuring that our patients have what they need when it comes to the medications they require. And what do I mean by that? This is the plan. You set a goal, you make a lot of friends, you know your particular audience, you're persistent as all get out, and then once in a while, you get really lucky. So I'll start here with the Canadian Pediatric Society. Back in 2017, the Canadian Pediatric Society released one of its first multi-year strategic plans, and it identified as a strategic priority expanding access to safe and effective medications for children and youth. I give a lot of credit to the CPS for identifying this as a strategic priority and the organization getting behind it. That credit belongs to these three people here. Terila Kaz is a clinical trials leader who has long railed about the lack of a pediatric rule in Canada. He's a neonatologist who was originally at CHEO, has since moved out to Alberta. Geert de Jong was the chair of the Drugs and Therapeutics Committee at the CPS at the time, a passionate advocate for drug safety. And Dr. Catherine Farrell, who's a pediatric intensivist at Saint-Justine, again, friends from across the country. She championed this particular priority, making it into the strategic priorities of the organization. And we were very specific about what it is we wanted as the CPS when we set out this work in 2017. And specific was one of the things we are. Specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound. What is necessary when you're telling government what to do? You don't go to government and say, hey, make medication safe and more available to children. That's entirely unhelpful. You do a deep dive like what's in that box. We called on government to immediately develop and implement pediatric regulation for Canada that mandates the submission and review of pediatric data when pediatric use of a drug is expected or anticipated. We were very clear on what we wanted, and we were very clear on when we wanted it, and I see no reason why this is not in any way actionable or realistic. And then with that very specific goal, we went out and made sure everybody else in our community was our friend, that they supported this and would endorse our recommendation. The easiest way for a politician to say no to anything you want to do is to find someone like you who disagrees. And they say, oh, gosh, there's risk then if there's disagreement. We built a choir of people from across the country, all the children's hospitals, all of the national child and youth health organizations, all of the organ-specific professional societies saying, this is incredibly important. So we had our goal and we had our choir. Then we needed to find our audience. This is deliberately small. You're not supposed to see it. This is the Health Canada org chart back in the day when we set out this work in 2017, 2018. When I first went to the Health Canada org chart to find who it was I needed to speak to, I naively assumed there'd be an Office of Pediatric Therapeutic Policy in there. Lots of offices, no office dedicated to pediatrics. I knocked on the door of one ADM and another ADM, one director general, another director general. They all said, wow, that sounds really important. Someone should do it, but it's not my job. I'm not responsible for pediatrics. So that became our first task, to build an audience, to actually create, like every other leading regulator in the world, an office dedicated to pediatric therapeutic needs because we didn't have one. So we couldn't get right to the business of advocating for our particular SMART objective because there was no one to advocate to. So we advocated to build an office. And it took us about 3 years to do that. Initially, they had like one sole person who wasn't very popular or well liked sitting in a back room somewhere. Then we said, no, 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 this is not enough. A manager and 2 people. They said, well, we're going to call this the Office of Rare Disease, but it will. I said, no, kids get common diseases too. Pshaw, it's time. So we opened an Office of Pediatrics. They included patient involvement. You can't win everything. And then eventually now it's led by a director. There's a team of 7 policy staff, and we can actually start cooking with gas. But this did not happen without persistence. Over this time, when we were talking about the need for a pediatric office and the need for a pediatric rule, there were 5 federal ministers of health. You brief one minister and you brief their policy staff and you make good friends, and then they get in trouble with the prime minister, and then they're out of cabinet, and then someone else comes in and you have that very same conversation and they are equally empathetic and they say, this is really important, I'm going to ask my bureaucrats to do that, and then they get shuffled off to Treasury Board, and then someone else new comes in. You have to really like the sound of your own voice, and you have to be really sure of what it is you're doing, because none of this happens terribly quickly. We have a new minister now. This work is not yet done, so this will be minister number 6, who we have made very clear that this is a pediatric priority. Our first meeting with her is coming up in 3 weeks' time, so wish us luck. I say this to you because it is not a single paper. It is not a single letter. It is not a single meeting. It is not a single conference presentation. If you're going to really commit to making meaningful legislative and regulatory change, it is about applying sustained and consistent pressure over a long period of time, like coal to a diamond. This doesn't happen overnight. And then lastly, it certainly does help if from time to time you get a little lucky. I don't speak Mandarin or Cantonese. This very well could say like chicken dinner, but I think it says crisis. And I have been told that the Chinese character for crisis is actually a combination of 2 individual characters, one being the character for danger and the other being the character for opportunity. A crisis equals danger plus opportunity. And that was absolutely our experience. Of all those ministers, I spent the most time with Jean-Yves Duclos. There were a few weeks when I think I spent more time with him than I did my own husband. And that was the case because there was that acute, during the triple-demic, there was a massive shortage of liquid formulations of Tylenol, acetaminophen and ibuprofen, and liquid suspensions of antibiotics. And how were we possibly going to manage this? Well, having established ourselves with the CPS as a group of people who knew something about pediatric drug policy, they started calling us, and we were happy to work with them, and we were happy to talk about compounding these medications, and we were happy to work with other regulators about importing unlicensed products into, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of every single one of those meetings, I said, Minister Duclos, I'm more than happy to help you with this, but there's this bigger problem when it comes to pediatric drug policy. And he said, yeah, we're going to get to this. Just let's finish this one thing. And to his credit, he is a man of his word. After almost 6 years of dedicated lobbying, there was a public promise made around the release of a PDAP, which was confirmed by a deputy minister. It went out for consultation in September of 2023, and a pilot project that explored, I know, we'll talk about the pilot thing. There was a pilot project launched in the winter of 2024, where Canada would say, you can voluntarily submit pediatric drug data when drug use in children can be expected or anticipated. But this is the kicker. But you don't have to submit it in a Canadian-specific form. Just send us what you sent to the FDA or the EMA, and we will look at that. That was launched a year and a half ago. It's coming to a close this February, and then there will be a need for all of us to put our foot on the gas, tell Health Canada that it needs to get to Gazette 1, which is the process of turning a voluntary pilot project into the regulatory authorities that we actually require. If you're interested in learning more about this, There's information on the Health Canada website about the pediatric development plan. That's what we're calling it here. And again, the twist is that we're not requiring pediatric data be submitted in Health Canada specific form. We don't want to discourage regulators from coming here in the first place. And this is tied to work, if we've got time to discuss it after work, related to the national priority list of pediatric drugs. We've worked with Health Canada on this project for the last 3 years, and this list was just published this September. And while the CPS has now established other important priorities for its next 3-year plan, this work will be located at the Child Health Policy Accelerator at SickKids. Very long story short, pharma has a lot of well-dressed lobbyists, high-paid lawyers wearing very expensive shoes, and they're in the ear of Health Canada and all of the political higher-ups. I believe pretty strongly that Canada's children need a good lobbyist too. And that's the work that we're going to be leading out of SickKids as we bridge the gap between what it is we know children need from a legislative and regulatory perspective and what it is we're doing to attend to those needs in the public policy space. So I'll close with this. Change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are, in fact, the ones that we have been waiting for. So I hope that I've been able to convince you through this that the legislative and regulatory space is not only our responsibility, but it can be extraordinarily fun. And I hope that you're willing to come along with us in the journey, because it won't get done unless we all put our foot to the gas together. Thank you.
Oh, you did have your speaker notes in the end. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. And unfortunately, we don't have as much time for discussion because this would have been a really kind of open discussion forum. But I want to first start by asking anyone in the audience if there's a question or a comment that you want to raise. And
Charlotte, I just want to say that was an incredible tour de force and no surprise from you. And yeah, really inspiring in terms of walking through the story and making it accessible to all of us. And you're far too humble about your leadership work in this space. And thank you. It's really inspiring to see the passion and the ground that you've made. And I just wanted to ask a question about, your original system. I totally understand that the first need is this pediatric regulatory. Has there been strategic value in terms of pharmaceuticals companies putting in their applications with adult data and not pediatric? Like, I think about that SLE drug, and there's clear evidence, but somebody, smart person, left it out for some reason when they submitted to Health Canada. Like, that's been strategy so that it goes through? It's a minute part of this, but I just am trying to understand why people, in the face of evidence, wouldn't put that in.
I mean, and that's how you and I think. If they're submitting the data anyway to the FDA or the EMA, why don't they just submit it here? Well, everything is a commercial decision when it comes to pharmaceutical manufacturers. Health Canada requires everything to be submitted in the Health Canada way, and that's incredibly discouraging to manufacturers. We're a teeny tiny market, and so we're 40 million people, and the pediatric market is a teeny tiny market within a really small market. So already we're sort of an undesirable destination for manufacturers. Over and above that, even if they get the drug approved, there are 15 public payers that they have to negotiate with in terms of getting it listed. So pharma has time and time again made the business decision that the narrowest possible application and review is the way to go forward, and the value associated with including pediatric data, formatting it, having it be reviewed, the back and forth with the regulator around it, and then negotiating with all of the different public payers at the end of the day simply isn't worth it. They are happy to exclude that part of the very, very small market for the gain they would have by not delaying their introduction to market by a year or 2 years.
yeah, thanks, Charlotte. And we have a few questions online as well, so I'll go quickly in between them. Neil.
Hi. So, as a pediatrician, I agree with your goals, but I have worked in drug development, and I do take issue with a couple of the things that you've said. First, pediatric development plans in other regions do not require the submission of data. They are just a plan.
Yeah.
So it's incorrect to say that these other regions require data. You just need to submit a plan to them. The other issue is that the problem with developing in Canada, and I have filed to Health Canada, is not Health Canada. The problem is what you just talked about. It's the long, very difficult road to actually getting listed. Um, and I think you would do well to think a little bit about that problem, and its impact on the availability of pediatric drugs, and not just on drug companies and demonizing them. It's fun to say that they have shiny shoes and that they have
They do.
well-heeled advocates, but that's actually not a fair way to look at it, and it doesn't actually move things forward.
So you are correct. The mandate is for a pediatric development plan. And if we had more time, we could dive into the nuance. How many of the pediatric plans actually become actually become indications. Francois Boucher is at the Harvard Center for Regulatory Excellence, and she's published widely on the conversion rate of plan to indication. And you're completely right. It is not 100%. But it's also not zero, and it's the best we've got. So we could say to pharma or regulators, you can't submit until the pediatric studies are completed. We know that the pediatric studies are going to lag. There's usually, depending on the drug and the class of drug, either 3 to 7 years before that data actually becomes available. But without the plan to begin with, which is a requirement, these studies would not be done. And the published evidence around the success of BCPA and PRIA in combination or in concert with each other, I actually think is incredibly compelling. So you're right, there's nuance there. Are they requiring the data? Are they requiring the plan? There's the plan for data, and there's a movement now south of the border to be firmer about market conditions related to the execution of that plan that's underway. I know they're doing a lot of work on that at Harvard right now.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm going to try, for people who can stay, we'll go 5 minutes over time. I had a question that was actually kind of related to Neil's. An observation that I would make in my particular perspective in rare disease and especially inborn diseases is that the regulators often ask for efficacy evidence in adults first. And unfortunately, for most of the diseases we treat, if you reach adulthood, the pathology is pretty darn fixed,
Yeah.
and there's not going to be much efficacy. And so, in the drug development world, if you have to show efficacy in a population that's not going to show efficacy, but you have a population in which you will be efficacy, and you're not allowed to start by doing your early efficacy trials there, that seems to me very reminiscent still of the protect your patients from research. And has any advocacy or progress been made in Canada, at least, in terms of targeting the right population for efficacy trials, early efficacy trials?
So when we talk about this ecosystem from early idea to preliminary drug development, the requirement for animal studies or no requirement for animal studies, that's quite controversial. What drug trials are going to be regulated or not regulated, all the way through to the public listing on 15 public formulas. It's a really, really complex ecosystem. There are hundreds to thousands of pages of regulations that inform virtually every step of that process. We couldn't possibly go into that, so I dove in on this one because it has particular resonance, but don't in any way disagree that there's reform work necessary in the preclinical and drug development space. Rare Kids Can, which is a platform that's led by now Thierry Lacaze, who I mentioned earlier, is very interested in regulatory advocacy in that space. And for people that want to stay behind, one of the things we're going to talk to the minister about is standard of care clinical trials being exempt from clinical trial regulations, and the need to reform this relationship between the SAP program and single patient studies. But you can see every tiny little thing that would potentially need to change is in and of itself sometimes a multi-year advocacy project. So couldn't agree more that there's lots about the ecosystem that's not functional. We've decided to focus part of our work on this pediatric rule because it is, I think, particularly problematic.
Yeah, and having worked in and with government as well, having a very focused ask at times can move the needle, and then you can get to the bigger asks. I think I saw Nirav's hand up. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, hi, Charlie. Thanks again. Very inspiring talk. And I think, as the theme you highlighted is that you need to start somewhere with the government,
Yeah.
and the proven model always is easier to sell than to go. So I'm a pediatric oncologist where actually I think more than 80% we fall in that bracket of probably even more than 80% when we're using off-label drugs. And that's always a challenge, right? And as highlighted, by already the earlier Neil and Ganesh as well, is I think the challenge that we are seeing, which is going the other way from all what you highlighted, is that there are a few drugs which are actually coming up first now with pediatric indications. Recently, we've had at least in oncology, and the challenge there is that they, as you said, for all the reasons, manufacturers don't have incentive to actually even submit an application for drug approval. And that is where the patient advocacy groups and in oncology at least are helping us, are trying to help companies submit and then also be a part with negotiations, because that is where eventually that interest will come, because for them we are a really small market.
Yeah.
And unless we as from market generate that ease of application for them, I think going in future it will always be challenging for them to come first. Unless there is a good adult indication, they'll always tag along pediatrics. But if there is a pediatric thing and a rare disease thing, unless we stimulate from within our community that we will help you get to the regulator, I don't think we complete the loop.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think Neil's point is well taken. We can't fully demonize the pharmaceutical industry. We do, however, need to be honest that their motivation is commercial in orientation and their actions speak to that. So we just have to be honest about what it is they want to do. To pediatric oncology specifically, one of the other things we didn't have a chance to talk about was the RACE Act. South of the border. So in the south of the border, they have moved beyond disease-based indications, and they are pushing manufacturers to look at mechanisms of action as opposed to indications, which would have huge applicability in cancer. So again, there's lots more work to do. This is an imperfect science, and the regulatory infrastructure is slow and clumsy. Science moves way, way, way faster. But the oncology universe south of the border has been leading on this again.
Yeah, thanks. And also their work on incorporating biomarkers and outcomes
Yeah.
for studies. I'm going to go for a couple more minutes. So we have like 5 questions online. So Jamie?
Thanks, Charlotte. Nice to see you again and hear you. Great presentation. I just we have a policy that we're putting forward to the federal government, but it is on to designate. It's new to me. I'm very new to this area, so I congratulate you. I'm learning, seeing a lot of roadblocks, but the policy is to change at the federal level is to designate traumatic brain injury as a chronic disease in Canada. So we started with the bill, but my comment and question is really the momentum really started when we asked the patients and the family what was the biggest priority for them. And in your presentation, and then they took we just are holding on to their coattails as researchers and pediatricians and working in partnership with them. So I didn't hear about. So I wondered, one, could this have been put forward as a bill? And two, how about patient and pediatric and children's adolescents advocacy?
Yeah, so I couldn't, again, we only had an hour, so there's lots of things to talk about. Patients' voices, and it's interesting because it can be member of parliament specific. This particular health minister is not interested in taking a meeting unless there is a directly affected person with lived experience in the meeting. So that's a real shift. We actually didn't see that for a couple of federal health ministers before. So building your audience and building out your choir should always engage and involve parents. We also didn't talk about how you can use the fourth estate, engaging the media in moving some of these issues forward. When it comes to talking about off-label drug use creating barriers and dangers, some of those messages are a bit nuanced, and I'm not entirely sure I trust even the best health reporters to carry that forward. But your point is well taken. That I spoke about the professional part of the choir. Patients and families should absolutely be a part of that choir as well.
I think one more question from the chat. How do you react when the FDA tells you that a drug can be used only for research in neonates when the drug has been used extensively and safely in other countries and the medication is available in different formulations, so off-label, really, in Canada, just for adults? So while you're making all this change and you have drugs that are only available off-label, and could be used in a neonate. Emmanuel is a neonatologist. What do you do in the meantime? I think is what she's asking.
So I'm curious if FDA means Health Canada. If Health Canada,
Okay, that's a good question.
yeah,
Yeah, no, I asked when I was working in Quebec, I'm talking about 18 years ago. Okay, the medication was available in Canada for adults. There was a formulation for pediatrics already ready in Europe that I was using before coming here. And when I asked, they said no, just for research. And the process was daunting. And I went through by myself and it ended very, very fast. Sorry.
yes. So another thing we didn't get into was pediatric formulations. So
Correct.
when you take an adult form of a drug and actually safely make it in a liquid formulation, that is an entirely separate application. Well, it's called an SNDS. It's a supplemental new drug submission. So there's work and cost for a manufacturer to bring a child formulation to Canada. Because we are a small market within a small market, there's a number of child-friendly formulations of products that are available elsewhere in the world that have never been brought here. I will point you to the National Priority List of pediatric drugs. About half of that priority list is attempting to attend to that particular need, calling on Health Canada to use what we call reliance authorities, rely on the approvals of trusted regulators to expedite and streamline the process of bringing these drugs to Canada. It is always a commercial decision to bring child-friendly formulations into our market, and we need to make it easier for manufacturers to do just that, because we know pediatric-friendly formulations are safer for kids. The real leaders in this space are the group at Saint-Justine, the Goodman Center for Pediatric Formulations, which is led by Dr. Catherine Latalienne. She's done a huge amount of work in that space.
Yeah, thanks. And I
Thanks.
think maybe we'll just give a last comment to Rob. He's been very patient with his hand up.
I think you mean me. I'm not sure. Robert?
Yeah, I do. Yep.
Yeah. Hi.
The one with the patient
Fantastic
hand.
present. Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic presentation. I just wanted to say, as someone who's also lived and worked south of the border for 20 years and advocated for single payer, I love what you had to say, and I really enjoyed listening to the process of working with legislators and thinking about it in that way. I think is really helpful for everybody to hear. I put in the chat a book by Marcia Angel, who's formerly, I think, one of the New England Journal of Medicine editors. And then she wrote a book called The Truth About the Drug Companies. It's a really quick and easy read. And I found it very helpful and insightful, especially with regards to the conversation we had about demonizing or not demonizing pharma. I think it's really a good way to get for those who haven't read it yet, to get in there and learn about that, because I think it's so relevant to this conversation and how we can move forward. So thank you.
Yeah. No, again, I don't intentionally want to demonize manufacturers. We are all part of this same ecosystem. But I think it's wise to understand, and hopefully this is one of the points in the book, that their decision making is commercial. And their decisions to bring or not bring child-friendly formulations, for example, to Canada, are market-based decisions. Our market is too small and it is too cumbersome to navigate through. So it is not in their financial industry to bring a child-friendly formulation of tacrolimus, for example, into Canada. There's no reason to not do it other than commercial reasons.
So we went 15 minutes over, and I'm thinking maybe actually we should invite someone from the Pharmaceutical Innovations group, maybe to come and speak as well. And you know, so many other topics I can have. But Charlotte, thank you for coming, and thank you for the talk.